Recognize the member for Nevis 1.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Madam President. I rise to make my contribution in support of the budget presented yesterday, Madam President, by the member for Nevis number 2, Minister of Finance and Premier. Madam President, I want to congratulate the mover of the budget, which by my tally is number 7 as Premier and Minister of Finance. Madam President, the theme subscribed in this budget by the mover, and I quote, investing for growth, building the framework to support a resilient and sustainable economy. I feel, Madam President, is timely. Madam President, before I get into my presentation in earnest, I feel that it was important of me, Madam President, to what I will call deal with a few housekeeping matters coming out of the presentation of the member for number 4. One of the things, Madam President, that jumped out at me from the presentation of the member for number 4, a statement was made that no export products from Nevis. And I find, Madam President, that that statement was, in my mind, a little unfortunate. It was unfortunate because just a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, we had a young, vibrant entrepreneur on the island of Nevis opening a window manufacturing company to manufacture windows here on the island of Nevis. Madam President, I am aware that we have a fencing company that manufactures fence wire here on the island of Nevis. I am aware, Madam President, that we have at least 2 very talented cabinet or carpentry establishment on the island of Nevis that does remarkable work when it comes to kitchen cupboards. I am aware, Madam President, that we have a galvanized company here on the island of Nevis. We have, Madam President, rum that is being produced or manufactured here on the island of Nevis. I was told to put a caveat and said illegal manufacturing of rum, Madam President. Madam President, I feel that we have been hearing from the other side that oftentimes they keep using this terminology that nothing is happening on Nevis. But is it that the member for number 4 is saying that to the young entrepreneur who have spent significant sums of money in investing in this window manufacturing, that his product is not good enough for exportation? Is that what is being said, Madam President? I leave that. Madam President, the member went on to say that, and I wrote it down, a solar-powered plant. I can't recall that at any time in the cabinet that I've been a part of for the last 6-7 years that we have projected or given any indication of a solar-powered plant. If I am misquoting, I stand to be corrected. Madam, what I find interesting as well, the member also spoke at length and eloquently from the audit report. I remember, Madam President, that there was a time that the same political party that the member now leads for how many years? How many years they were in government?
5 and 18
For 5 years and 18 null and void months, they never tabled one audited report in this parliament. Not one. So I find it strange, Madam President, that the member find it necessary to quote from the audit report. And I sat there and I said, you know, this is remarkable. Remarkable, Madam President, that we have done so well that we are able to provide the audited report for the member to peruse. Madam President, one last thing before I get into my... the member indicated that we are forced to retire early. And I hope I capture what the member was saying accurately. I believe that the laws in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis specify that persons are to retire at age 62. And I was at a graduation yesterday, Madam President, with some young, vibrant, talented sixth formers. Are we to say to them that the government will keep on persons in the civil service and those in the non-established section to work until they take their last breath, Madam President? And it was a statement that I thought was saying to those six farmers, the government is not going to make any provision for you to get a job on the island of Nevis, because we will ensure that persons who are working, that they will work until they can't work no more. And Madam President, I just thought I would deal with those few housekeeping matters. There is one more that I will deal with that a little later. Madam President, the ministry that I have the privilege to lead currently has given me cause to use for my presentation repositioning the Ministry of Communication and Works, et.al., to support a resilient and sustainable Nevis. I want to use that theme, Madam President, for my presentation, because the theme of the budget spoke specifically to building the framework to support a resilient and sustainable economy. And I've took that, Madam President, and I've tweeted it slightly. And I've said repositioning the Ministry of Communication and Works to support a resilient and sustainable Nevis. Madam President, when I look at the makeup of my ministry, Ministry of Communications, we have the Department of Public Works with the Building Division, the Government Repair Shop, and the Asphalt Plant. We have the Project Management Unit. We have the Department of Labor. We have the Department of Physical Planning and Environment, the Nevis Water Department with the Integrated Water Resource Unit, Posts with the Philatelic Bureau, and the Nevis Disaster Management. When I look at those various departments, Madam President, I am persuaded that all of these departments play a critical role in the development of Nevis. And I will go further, Madam President, that they play a critical role in the sustainability of the island of Nevis. So if we get it wrong, Madam President, it could have catastrophic consequence on the island of Nevis. Madam President, a statement by the member for number 4, and this is my last house cleaning business. Woefully inadequate. Those were her words as it relates to the budget. The budget was woefully inadequate. I went to the budget address, Madam President, and I looked specifically at section 24 of the budget. And I want to read it, Madam President, with your permission. Therefore, Madam President, our primary balance has contracted by 4.7 million, moving from a surplus of 15.78 million at the end of October 2022 to a surplus of 10.98 million as of October 31st, 2023. Our overall balance moved from a surplus of 1.3 million at the end of October 2022 to a deficit of 3.9 million as of October 31st, 2023. The fiscal deficit remained relatively unchanged, moving from 21.25 million in 2022 to 21.64 million at the end of October 2023. Now, Madam President, the wonders of technology. I went and I looked, did a little quick search, and I came upon this website, Government Budget Deficit, at a website called countryeconomy.com. And I was curious, Madam President, to look at some of the countries who were carrying a deficit budget. Madam President, do we know the number 1 country on that list?
US.
Right fella. Who tops the list? Member for number 3 gave the answer. United States of America, the country with a deficit budget in 2021. What was the percentage, Madam President? 11.62%. Second on the list, Madam President, we used to call her Great Mother England. Second on the list in 2022, with a deficit budget of 6.26%. Then we have, Madam President, one of the most industrialized country on planet Earth, Germany, in 2022 with 2.5% deficit. Following Germany, we have France, we have Japan, we have Spain, we have Italy, we have Portugal, we have Greece, we have Ireland. Sorry, not Ireland. Ireland actually did not have a deficit budget. There's a country here, I did not even know that that country exists, Andorra. And then, Madam President, 20 miles away. How far Antigua is from us? 30 miles away from us? 60 miles away from us? Antigua and Barbuda. On the first page, with a deficit budget. And their deficit budget, Madam President, in 2020 stood at 6.36%. I will go no further, Madam President. I will share that information with the Premier. Madam President, I want to make a point about this deficit budget, because it seems to me that there are those who believe that because a country runs a deficit budget, that the government is doing something untoward, or the government is mismanaging the affairs of the country. Madam President, what are some of the benefits of a national deficit budget? With your permission, Madam President, I am going to list 5. 5, only 5. One, promoting economic growth. That's what they say about deficit budget. When the government spends more than it collects in revenue, it injects money into the economy. This increased spending can stimulate economic activity and lead to a higher GDP growth. Madam President, from the economists and people from, that is what is being said about a deficit budget. Number two, preventing or mitigating economic downturns. And this is the explanation, Madam President. During recessions, remember that great recession in the United States? What did President Obama did? Spend like he crazy. Spend like he was crazy. During recessions or periods of economic slowdown, a deficit budget can be used as a tool to offset, reduce private sector spending, and maintain overall aggregate demand in the economy. Speaking about deficit budget, Madam President. Number three, investing in infrastructure and public services. Let me read that again. Investing in infrastructure and public services. Deficit spending allows the government to invest in infrastructure projects, such as building roads, bridges, and schools, which can have a long-term economic benefits. It also enables spending on public services, such as health care and education, which can enhance the social well-being. Madam President, I remember as a little boy, there was this road that was being constructed called the Southeast Peninsula Road. And all manner of evil was said against the government then about that road. I am happy, Madam President, that the Prime Minister of that era is still alive today to see the benefit of the construction of that Southeast Peninsula Road. Madam President, number four, addressing social needs and inequality. Deficit budgets can be used to fund social welfare programs. What happened in COVID, Madam President? Such as unemployment benefit, education subsidies, and healthcare initiatives aimed at reducing poverty and inequality. These programs can help to promote social well-being and provide a safety net for vulnerable individuals and families. And finally, Madam President, number five, facilitating investment in human capital. Deficit spending can be used to fund education and training programs, which can improve the workforce skill and productivity, leading to long-term economic growth. Now, Madam President, here is the caveat. Here is the caveat. It is important to note that while deficit budgets can provide benefits, they should be used prudently and in line with the country's overall fiscal and economic goals to prevent unsustainable debt levels. Now, that is the caveat, Madam President. And this budget, in my humble submission, Madam President, deals squarely with this final statement. You see the mitigative measures, Madam President, that is outlined in this budget? Because the budget have been a deficit budget, the good people at the Ministry of Finance, smart people at the Ministry of Finance have said, look, we have reached to a point where we need to take some action. And this budget provides, Madam President, for the country to start taking some action as it relates to its deficit budget, Madam President. Madam President, I don't want the people of Nevis to feel that the Minister of Finance to feel that the ministers on this side to feel that we are on a spending binge that took us to this deficit budget. But Madam President, the reality is that over time, it was absolutely necessary. Madam President, the time has come to implement the mitigative measures outlined in the budget address. And the Minister of Finance would have spoke about a few. Reassessing certain costs, Madam President, looking at certain costs, tightening up on some overdue invoices as it regards to things like NEVLEC and Water Department, Madam President. All of those, Madam President, are a part of making sure that we begin to deal with the deficit budget. I don't want anybody to feel that it is all gloom and doom because we are dealing with a deficit budget. But there has been, Madam President, times for it to be absolutely necessary, Madam President. Now, Madam President, I want to focus my presentation now on the various departments that I have responsibility for. I will start with the Nevis disaster management. And I want to read into the record of this House, Madam President, the executive summary of the Nevis disaster management. I found it interesting, but it was a statement or a summary that I hope that perhaps we can see and hear a bit more often and a bit more frequent. And I'm going to read it, Madam President. The Nevis Disaster Management Department completed another hectic and productive work program. The transition to the Ministry of Communications was a blessing in disguise and has reaped dividends in enhanced cooperation and collaborations with critical agencies. The unmatched level of support and cooperation were the driving forces that boosted morale, enhanced productivity, provide opportunities for growth, personal development, and staff promotion. I didn't write it. I'm reading what they gave me to say. And Madam President, why I feel that this statement is important? Because I want, Madam President, that all across the civil service, you see that word, enhanced productivity? I am hoping, Madam President, that all across the civil service we can hear those kind of language. Provided opportunities for growth, Madam President. Personal development and staff promotion. While at times, Madam President, the circumstances does not allow, but I want all across the entire service that the workers of the civil service can feel and be in a position where they can say and use this kind of language. They need to be motivated, Madam President, and they can motivate themselves, Madam President. This, for me, Madam President, was a very encouraging statement. And I want to say, Madam President, that with this kind of language, I believe that we are going to have a very robust and interesting interaction in 2024 and beyond. Madam President, I want to share the vision of the Nevis disaster management. The vision is building a resilient nation. And the member for number 4 used those language kind of loosely this morning. Spoke about building resilience and sustainability. And I feel, Madam President, that while those language were being used this morning, a department like the disaster management is saying to us at all times, they are in the business already of building a resilient nation. Nothing new. The mission, Madam President, to maximize the use of available resources to promote effective communication, collaboration, safety consciousness, and critical thinking. Critical thinking. I sat for 2 hours this morning and I listened to the presentation. Madam President, I will move on. The function, Madam President, of the Nevis disaster management. The core functions of the Nevis disaster management are policy development. The Disaster Management Department provides assistance to stakeholders' ministries with regards to policy development, providing general guidance to implementing strategies and provide a mechanism to control. Coordination. The Disaster Management is a coordinating agency and coordinates all activities relevant to the phases of disaster management cycle. It plays a leading role critical to emergency response. For example, A, analyze situations and decide how expeditiously and effectively to respond. B, direct and coordinate response forces in accordance with the incident command structure. Coordinate with other jurisdictions. And D, maximize the use of available resources efficiently and effectively. And while I speak, Madam President, about the disaster management structure, the disaster management framework is a serious framework, Madam President. It starts with the Nevis Island Assembly Cabinet of Ministers. Then it has the Nevis Disaster Management Committee. Then it has, Madam President, the Nevis Disaster Management Department. Then, Madam President, the disaster management subcommittees, which include district chairpersons, community emergency response team, and volunteers. Madam President, building resilience. Building resilience. And how do we build resilience, Madam President, when it comes to disaster management? Disaster management encourages the development of several types of plans. These include disaster, emergency, communications, and business community plans. These plans, Madam President, outline approaches for reducing the impact hazard, roles and responsibility of individuals and agencies. It focuses on emergency response and short-term recovery to a disaster occurrences are also highlighted. Building resilience, Madam President, it speaks about training. It also speaks about public information and education. Madam President, all of these play a critical role, Madam President, in building resilience when it comes to disaster management. Madam President, in 2023, we saw a number of weather systems that came through the region. And one of the mechanisms, Madam President, that in my mind protected the island of Nevis and the people of Nevis was the Nevis flood management system. The Nevis flood management system. And Madam President, the Nevis flood management system comprised of 2 water level stations, Batgut and Campsgut, Siren Station in Stony Grove, and several rain gauges located on the agricultural plantations and water services reservoirs located around the island. That system, Madam President, was absolutely critical to give warning to the island of Nevis. Madam President, we saw that the tropical storm Nicole on November 7th, 2022, we saw, Madam President, that the rain gauge system at Nisbet suffered some damage since 2022. And that, Madam President, was a critical system in the monitoring of rainfall on the island of Nevis. It was eventually replaced, Madam President, in May of 2023. Took some time, but I'm extremely happy, Madam President, to see that we was finally able to get that system up and running. Madam President, we have some challenges, and I am one who is going to bring the good, the bad, not necessarily the ugly, but the good and the bad. We have some challenges. We have, Madam President, a number of flood management systems that, in my mind, are outdated. And let's face it, the Minister of Technology would tell me that something that was pretty good 2 years ago is now obsolete because of the rapid change in technology, Madam President. We have some data loggers, Madam President. Perhaps they are functioning, but not to the level that we would like. They are outdated. The access to some of these apparatus, Madam President, we have to do some work to get to them. But all of these equipment, Madam President, in the new year we will have to ensure that we either replace, modernize, and do what we need to do, Madam President, to get them functioning at the level that we really want them to function, Madam President. In 2023, Madam President, the disaster management were involved in some safety inspections. And this, Madam President, is something that often concerns me. It's occupational safety and health legislation. I want to use this rostrum, Madam President, that process needs to be completed at the federal level. It needs to be. Madam President, this is almost at the point of urgent. We are, however, Madam President, using certain international standards when it comes to occupational health and safety standard here on the island of Nevis. And we need to ensure, Madam President, that the legislative framework is put in place to ensure that not only disaster, not only Labor Department, Planning Department, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, all of the departments, Madam President, can have the necessary health and safety legislation to give guidance and to govern how they function in this environment, Madam President. We saw a number of public awareness initiatives, Madam President. The Nevis Disaster Management was engaged in a 12-month multi-hazard campaign, which did a number of things, Madam President, and it provides a year-round awareness and education program for the island of Nevis. This year, I believe that they would have used the faith-based organizations in implementing that public awareness campaign, Madam President. Madam President, have had a number of emergency responses. And one of them in particular, drinks in bottles. We are thinking about the biggest cultural event ever. And I'm going to share some more information with the Minister of Culture. This, Madam President, needs to be looked at. Madam President, we are saying that the disaster management had a very busy year 2023. And I'm hoping, Madam President, that while we go forward, we must ensure that we put all the necessary mitigative measures in place to alleviate some of these problems that can lead to even bigger and greater problems that we would like. Madam President, the 2023 hurricane season, and we often listen to institutions like the Colorado State University for potential predictions in our hurricane season. We were told that we would have a below average season with some 13 named storms. We were told that 6 could become hurricanes and 2 major hurricanes. Madam President, we had 1 or 2 tropical systems that came through the islands. And I believe, Madam President, that it was only through the grace and the mercy of God that we did not suffer any significant damage. Which brings me to the next point. I believe that there will be a service this evening at the St. Thomas's Anglican Church at 7 p.m. where we are hoping and we are expecting to give God the thanks and the mercy and the praise for protecting us during the hurricane season. I want to use this opportunity, Madam President, to all those who are hearing my voice, to please go and partake of that service, giving thanks to God for the protection during this hurricane season 2023. Madam President, in 2024, again, we are hoping to have a very robust calendar of events. And Madam President, I want to encourage the general public to continue to give their support to the Disaster Management Department. Give their support and their cooperation to the Disaster Management Department, because their goal and their aim, Madam President, is to protect life, property, and limb, and to give adequate warning, Madam President, so that we can see the best outcome possible. Madam President, 2023, we saw Tropical Storm Philippe on the 3rd of October, 50 miles per hour. And while it did not cause, Madam President, as much damage, we believe that it would have caused some minimal damage in the agriculture sector. Where bananas and a number of greenhouses and shade houses, Madam President, were affected.
Very resilient, so we're bouncing back.
Exactly.
Very resilient.
I am seeing, Madam President, reported damage in the amount of $425,347.60. We also saw the passage of Hurricane Tammy. Madam President. And Madam President, Hurricane Tammy, and we saw a recorded cost of just over $5 million in damage. Madam President, I will wrap up with the disaster management, Madam President, by indicating that in 2024, we intend to embark on a number of training programs, such as first responder advanced medical training, dispatch training, radio communication techniques, CERT training, Madam President, and other such activities that we believe would help to strengthen and build resilience on the island of Nevis, Madam President. Madam President, I will move very quickly to the planning department. And Madam President, the planning department, in my mind, have been one of those departments that continue to do exemplary work, Madam President. They continue to be the gatekeepers of our built structures here on the island of Nevis. They continue to give guidance, Madam President, when it comes to certain aspects of our environment. And Madam President, I want to say here that while we continue to work within certain legislative framework, Madam President, we still have some more work to do. I know that we have the Nevis Physical Development Plan to bring to this Parliament. We have the designation of the protected areas to come to this Parliament with. Most of that work, Madam President, is completed. We also have, Madam President, some amendments to the advertisement control regulations. And I know that the legal department would have done tremendous work on all of these legislations, Madam President. So we are hoping that early in the new year, we can come to this Parliament and see the passage of these various pieces of legislation, Madam President. Madam President, the department also in 2023 were engaged in a number of training exercises. They were engaged in drone simulation training. And this is a critical piece of training, Madam President, that deals with the usage of drone in mapping of the island of Nevis. And that, Madam President, will be a critical component in the island's development. Madam President, we saw the involvement of the Department of Physical Planning in building national capacity in St. Kitts and Nevis. And this, Madam President, was a climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation training. This was a 6-month training program, which is still ongoing. And we are hoping that at the end of it, Madam President, we will be able to build even greater resilience in our climate change mechanism, Madam President. Madam President, they were also involved in the JEF 6, improving environmental management through sustainable land management. Madam President, this was funded by the Global Environmental Facility, or JEF. And that too, Madam President, saw the department involved in the project launch. Project was launched on February 2022, where the proposal for reforestation in degraded lands in New River, Indian Castle, and areas above the 1,000 feet contour, using traditional food trees as well as threatened species. Madam President, this was an initiative that I feel will also bear great fruit for the island of Nevis. Madam President, we saw that the Nevis Physical Planning Department was also involved in the St. Kitts and Nevis biannual update report and third National Communication Validation Workshop. This session focused on the determination of the existing national circumstance and allow for the creation of opportunities for climate-related project financing. Madam President, we also participated in the voluntary national review, Madam President, and that report was presented to the United Nations in October of 2023, Madam President. Madam President, for the year thus far, the Planning Department would have received some 293 applications with 227 approvals. We saw some 66 with some compliance issues. Madam President, from December 2022 to November 2023, we saw some 139 active construction sites, Madam President. And I want to just give a brief breakdown as to the categories of those applications. Tourism-related projects, 9. Apartments, 5. Commercial industrial projects, 44, Madam President. Madam President, while I move on from the Department of Physical Planning, as I said earlier, we have a number of ordinances and legislative documents that we are hoping that we will be able to bring to this Parliament in the new year. We are hoping that we will be able to bring to Parliament the protected areas legislation. We are hoping, Madam President, that the information sharing with architects, contractors, and surveyors and realtors on the use of planning regulations would also have some greater audience in the general public. We are hoping, Madam President, that we will soon bring to this Parliament the Nevis Physical Development Plan for its final approval. We expect, Madam President, to build out the capacity of our environmental unit, and we are expecting, Madam President, that in early 2024, we will see the expansion of our GIS unit at the Physical Planning Department, Madam President. Madam President, I want to move very quickly to our Public Works Department. And the Public Works Department have been very busy throughout 2023. It was a challenging year, but they've been very busy, Madam President. And the Public Works Department also consists of the repair shop and the asphalt plant. But as I said earlier, Madam President, my theme for this budget is the repositioning of the Ministry of Communication and Works. And we have started that process. We have seen, Madam President, in January of this year, we were able to get the services of an architect with a bachelor's degree in architecture. We have seen, Madam President, we were able to attract the services of a surveyor. We worked with one surveyor for some time, and I often wonder how he manages. We have seen, Madam President, we were able to also attract the services of an engineer. And all of these young, talented professionals is being positioned, Madam President, to reposition the Ministry of Communication and Works for 2024 and beyond. Now, I have a request, and I'm going to make it here in Parliament. We are looking for a quantity surveyor. to tie all of this together. You have the architects, you have the engineers, you have the surveyors. The little part that is kind of missing is that quantity surveyor. And I know that the engineers and the architects often do some of that, but we want to separate that work. And we want to be able, Madam President, to put in place that quantity surveying unit that will be able to give greater oversight of some of these projects, Madam President. Madam President, we have the building division. And that is a department that is being called upon by probably every arm of government to change a door, change a lock, change a door closure. Little things, Madam President, that we feel can make people's life a bit more comfortable. They continue to do the necessary renovations of government spaces, Madam President. And they are a small bunch, they are a tight bunch, but they continue to get quite a significant amount of work done, Madam President, when it comes to the upkeep of government spaces. We have the repair shop. And I was just sent a video this afternoon of one of the workers there at the government repair shop. We embarked on a project, I think it was last year, to construct, Madam President, a building for the auto body repair workers. In the past, they were out under a tree doing welding. And I felt, Madam President, that that was not the best working environment for some of these professionals. And they are now occupying, Madam President, a building there for them to do their welding, for them to do certain other aspects, Madam President, when it comes to their services there at the auto repair shop. Indeed, it's a big improvement, Madam President. Madam President, the asphalt plant is also a critical unit for the public works. And we all knew about the fire that took place back in December of 2022 that created some difficulty for us here on the island of Nevis, Madam President. That asphalt plant, Madam President, have since been repaired. We have seen the installation of electrical surveillance devices. We have seen, Madam President, the complete installation of the entire electrical system that control that asphalt plant. And we have seen, Madam President, the refurbishment of the storage tank itself that actually heat the asphalt plant. We have replaced the heating element, the motors, almost a complete new facility there, Madam President. And I want to thank the hardworking staff there at the asphalt plant. They are the kind of folks that is behind the scenes. But even though you are not seeing them, Madam President, you are seeing their work. And I really want to thank them for the hard work that they have put in over the past 12 months in particular, when the asphalt plant was literally down and out. Madam President, we have the road and bridge division. Another happy bunch, and they continue to do our curb and slipper works. They continue to do our asphalting. They continue to ensure, Madam President, that the finished product is one that we all can be proud of, Madam President. They continue to deal with a lot of drainage issues here on the island of Nevis. They continue to make, Madam President, the roadways and the sidewalks throughout the island much better improved, Madam President. Madam President, from June 2023, we saw some roadwork, or the continuation of the roadwork at the Alberta Plain Community Center. And we saw the reconstruction of the side street at the old Maud Smith Preschool. And for those who, when I said old, not the new one, the old one in Upper Bar. We saw, Madam President, the construction of the block perimeter wall, concrete driveways, concrete sidewalks, and dry stone wall at the Alberta Payne Community Center. We saw the construction of concrete sidewalks along the concrete pull-off parking area in the community center, Madam President. And all of these works, Madam President, was over in the Bath Village area over the last 6 months. And we saw the practical completion of that stretch of road, Madam President, from the community center all the way over to, I think the gentleman's name is Mr. Crafton Dick in that area? Rafton? Rafton Dick. Madam President, looking forward to 2024 for the Public Works Department. We want to see, Madam President, some improvement at the repair shop. This government, Madam President, have spent some significant sums on some equipment, the paver and the asphalt machine. We have a plan, Madam President, to construct a facility that will store these pieces of equipment. We believe that they can give us 20, 30 years. But they will only be able to give us that time frame, Madam President, if we take good care of them. And the only way in which we can take good care of them is if we shelter them and if we protect them. Madam President, we are hoping that we can see some drainage infrastructure in and around Charlestown. We are hoping, Madam President, we have some work to do up in my good friend constituency in Gingerland. And I know he's not allowing me to sleep too much. He keeps reminding me.
Yes.
Madam President, we have, Madam President, the stretch of road in the area of, I think his name, Marvin Hanley Garage, going up to the town, Chapman, Madam President, and we can go all around Nevis where there is an urgent and a desperate need for road improvement. I was waiting for that too. Madam President, we have the first phase of the church going to Hamilton Road to do in 2024. And why we are doing the first phase? Because we believe that the geothermal project will give some guidance as to the route of the underground cable from Hamilton to Prospect. And it really doesn't make sense for us to do a stretch of road, and when the geothermal project comes on stream, we might have to make some adjustment. So we are going to do from the entrance of the Island Main Road there in Churchground all the way over to Hamilton in the Hamilton area. Madam President, we also are hoping that we will see the finalize and implementation of the department organizational structure chart. And we feel, Madam President, that while there are some overlapping in duties and responsibilities, we are looking at a complete top to bottom comprehensive look all across the ministry and to see where and how we can better structure, Madam President, the various departments and organizations. We expect in 2024 to provide some additional training in auto mechanics, in road construction, in paving. We will seek to operationalize a full-time maintenance team, Madam President, with the Public Works Department to focus strictly on maintenance and upkeep of our roadway assets, Madam President. And those are some of the objectives that we are hoping to see in 2024, Madam President. Madam President, I will turn very quickly to the post office. And Madam President, we started a pilot project at the post office. The internal management system, or the counter automation. And this was a project, Madam President, that we embarked on with Syncit. And I believe that we waited for a while, but it was generally felt that we needed to move ahead with our internal management system here on the island of Nevis. I am happy to report that that is well on the way, Madam President. We are now in the testing phase of this system, and we expect to roll out that internal management system in the first quarter of 2024. I believe that the IT is the hosting agent for the server for that unit. I believe so, Madam President. Madam President, we are also hoping that we will continue at the post office to invest in training of the postal workers. And this is an important component of the operation, Madam President, of the post office. It is important because we recognize that while we are not necessarily selling a lot of stamps, Madam President, while that business model have fallen off, we are recognized, Madam President, everybody is buying on Amazon, everybody is buying on, what's the others? What? eBay and all of those. Fashion home? Yes, Madam President. So, Madam President, it means, therefore, that the services at the post office must be dynamic. It must be, because the needs of the customer continue to change, Madam President, and we have to stay apace. We have seen, Madam President, that there continues to be some training in these various areas, and we have had 2 workers who was in Barbados recently on some training as it regards to different operational mechanism as it regards to post office, Madam President. And the idea is that once these officers were trained, then we can continue the training process in-house, Madam President. Madam President, I am delighted that in 2023, we continue the centenarian initiative. And I'm happy that our 3rd centenarian, Mrs. Leontine Clark, he quick to say, I'll get into that. Madam President, Mrs. Leontine Clark, who was recognized on the 23rd of November, Madam President. And I want to congratulate Mrs. Clark and family. And I want to say that while we celebrate Mrs. Clark, this is a lady, Madam President, that have made significant contribution to the Nevision community. An accomplished pianist. I believe some may argue probably one of the best, if not the best, Madam President. And we were able to recognize her with the centenarian edition for 2023. The minister from Gingerland says she is from Gingerland. Yes. But I want to say to the minister, Madam President, that the oldest person in Nevis is from Hamilton. As a matter of fact, you see, I'm corrected, Madam President, in the Federation. From Hamilton?
Remember we had somebody under 6.
Madam President, and just a couple days ago we went to a 90th, a gentleman who made 90. And Madam, I still can't believe that the gentleman is 90. I honestly still cannot believe that the gentleman is 90. I am still a little hesitant to believe that he's 90. He looks nothing close to 90, Madam President. And that is saying, I'm going a little bit off script here. And that is saying, Madam President, that our people are living longer and the quality of life, Madam President, is such that they can enjoy their lives even up to 100, 104, 90 and upwards. And whatever it is, Madam President, Madam President, for the post office, we have seen a little downturn in the revenue. And we recognize, Madam President, that throughout 2023, we have had some challenges. Some of those challenges we are still trying to sort out at the federal level to ensure that the loss of revenue can be mitigated against, Madam President, in 2024 and beyond. The expenditure at the end of November 2023 was $1.22 million, a marginal increase over 22. The expenditure at the end of November 2023 was $1,222,180, which represent a marginal increase over 2022, which stood at $1,155,260. Whereas the revenue at November 2023 stood at $539,771, while for the same period of last year amounted to $689,565. And Madam President, as I said before, we are aware of some of the challenges and we are still working through trying to bring some resolution, Madam President, on some of those challenges. Madam President, I will turn very quickly to our Labor Department. And the Labor Department, Madam President, have been, again, very active in 2023. We saw, Madam President, that the Nevis Labor Department were very active and participated in a number of critical areas here in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. They would have participated in the Caribbean Community Skills National Committee. They were represented, Madam President, on that committee. They were able to be a part of the National Minimum Wage Advisory Committee that would have made a representation and proposals as it regards to an increase in the minimum wage and the supporting policies. Madam President, they would have been on the National Tripartite Committee to address the status of draft labor codes for the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, Madam President. So they have played a critical role, Madam President, as it regards to these three areas that is of utmost importance to the island and to the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. Madam President, the Labor Department continues to act as an employment agency unit. And I'm proud of this unit, Madam President, because they have sought to be able to match the needs of the various businesses throughout the length and breadth of Nevis with the requisite skill set of persons who are looking employment. And Madam President, I want to give an idea of some of the establishment or businesses that have sought the services of the Labor Department. I'm wondering if I should call these names, Madam President. I don't know if these businesses would want me to. I would defer that, Madam President. Let me leave that alone. But I see, Madam President, some very established business, let me say that, some very well-established businesses here on the island of Nevis. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 34 of them, Madam President, would have sought the services of the Nevis Labor Department to find, Madam President, the appropriate person to fill the vacancies in their establishment. Madam President, we have seen that they continue to engage in training and workshops. We have seen some very intense staff training. We have seen, Madam President, some UE Spanish for business and travel short courses. We have seen staff members who would have went through the UE Law for Human Resource Practitioners course. We have seen, Madam President, the Labor Market Information System. All of these, Madam President, were training that the labor staff would have been exposed to, Madam President. Madam President, we also saw the continued annual routine inspections on businesses throughout the island of Nevis. And, Madam President, they often take these inspections to make sure that there are compliance, that our businesses throughout the island enforce what is mandated to them under the labor legislation. They would have gone in, Madam President, in some establishment and identified some unsafe working conditions. All of these, Madam President, were done by our labor department. I spoke, Madam President, about the employment agency unit. And they were able, Madam President, to give some great assistance to persons that were seeking employment. They would have assisted them in resume and cover letter writing. They would have assisted them in interview preparation, appropriate workplace behaviors and ethics, and counseling and mentorship session, Madam President. Madam President, all of these activities took place at our Labor Department here in Charlestown. Madam President, I want to turn very quickly to Career Fair 2023. And the aim of Career Fair 2023, Madam President, was to focus on technical and vocational skills. They would have partnered with Advanced Vocational Education Center, or AVEC. Madam President, we saw representation in electricity and carpentry, construction, mechanic. Madam President, we saw plumbing, heavy equipment. The Four Seasons, Madam President, would have also partnered with us. And Madam President, the Nevis Library Services, a broad section of the technical aspect, Madam President, throughout the island, and I would even dare say throughout the Federation, was represented at Career Fair 2023, Madam President. Plans are already afoot, Madam President, for Career Fair 2024, and we are hoping that that will definitely be bigger and better, Madam President, than Career Fair 2023. Madam President, at the end of the year 2023, or at this stage, we would have seen some 63 inspections or business that would have been inspected by the Nevis Labor Department. We have inspected 3 banks, 8 commercial businesses, 5 construction entities, 2 financial businesses, 4 hotels, 1 manufacturing, 25 restaurants, 9 service industry, 1 statutory corporation, 2 telecommunications businesses, and 3 transportation business, Madam President. Madam President, the Nevis Labor Department were also involved in the labor disputes, the settlement, or as they sought to do their very best, Madam President, to bring about some resolution as it regards to a number of disputes here on the island. In the agriculture sector, we saw 15 disputes that were dealt with. Banking 1, commercial 18. Madam President, we saw 17 in the hotel sector, 22 in the services sector. Madam President, all of these, Madam President, were disputes that were dealt with by our Labor Department. And I want to give, Madam President, a quick synopsis of the dispute types. At the top of the train, Madam President, we saw dismissal and termination with 43. Harassment, 0. I like that number. Harassment, Madam President, 0. It means, Madam President, that our working environment here on the island of Nevis, well, let me be careful, Madam President. I'm going to walk that back a bit. I'm going to walk it back a bit. We have 0 for harassment. I am hoping, Madam President, that we are not seeing on the island of Nevis that harassment on the workplace is not being reported. Let me put it that way. And let me say this, that if it is that persons are being harassed on their work, they have every right, Madam President, to have those harassment addressed. Yeah, well, I say 0, but I'm saying if they are not being reported, then they ought to be reported. Madam President, notice pay, 16. Issue of wages, 26, Madam President, giving a total of 149, Madam President. Madam President, the mover of the budget would have given some numbers as it regards to employment. I will go with those numbers. And here is why, Madam President. The numbers from the Labor Department is slightly different. But I want to say, Madam President, that perhaps the best guide and the best measure should actually be the Social Security numbers. They're slightly different. I actually did a comparison. They were slightly different. But what I want to say, Madam President, we continue to see over the various quarters of 2023 that there is a continuous increase in employment on the island of Nevis. That is the point, Madam President. That is the point. In the first quarter of 2023 versus the second quarter of 2023, the numbers are the same. Of the third quarter of 2023, there was about an increase of 35, 38, Madam President. And then in the final quarter, and the final quarter is not completed yet, we saw an increase of, what's that? 5. But the point, Madam President, in every quarter of 2023, we saw at least the labor force is holding steady, or there was a slight increase, Madam President. Madam President, the employment agency, and I spoke to that earlier, the total number of applicants for January 2023 to January 2023 to November 2023, we saw a total number of 265 applicants to the employment agency. And that is saying, Madam President, that the various businesses throughout the island of Nevis are utilizing the services of our employment agency so that they can find the right person, Madam President, to fill those vacancies, Madam President. Madam President, the Department of Labor have an ambitious agenda for 2024. Of course, Career Fair 2024 is already in the planning. Training of staff, Madam President. They hope to embark on some workshop and counseling session. Madam President, they intend to host a week of activity between the month of April to the commencement of World Day for Safety and Health, Madam President, and annual inspection of business places. The employment agency will continue to function, and they will continue to partner with TVET and AVEC, Madam President, to expose our young people to technical training, Madam President, in 2024. Madam President, I now come to the Water Department. And the Water Department would have had another very active year, Madam President, albeit that the year started for the Water Department, I think, perhaps a month or 6 weeks late, or normally they would return on the second week in January. They would have come back on the end of February, early March. So that's about a month, Madam President. Madam President, we saw in 2023, the Water Department would have installed some 1,500 feet of 4-inch PVC pipes to replace a 2-inch PVC pipe in the Brown Hill area. We saw, Madam President, approximately 800 feet of 2-inch pipe was installed at Colquhoun Estate on the project that we call the Banjo Road, Madam President. We saw, Madam President, some work that was done in the Bath Village project. We saw, Madam President, in the TDC area, we would have replaced a 4-inch cast iron pipe with a 4-inch PVC pipe, Madam President. We saw, Madam President, approximately 6,000 feet of 6-inch HDPE, or high-density polyurethane pipes, were installed from Cliff Dwellers to Hurricane Hill. And that, Madam President, was in conjunction and collaboration with the Island Main Road Improvement Project. We saw, Madam President, that in the Monstrat Village there in St. John's, we call it the Monstrat Village, but it's a section where I believe that a number of monstrations would have taken up residence after the volcano activity in Monstrat. And you know that the island of Nevis would have been...
Remember, you have 4 minutes. 4.
4?
4 minutes.
Madam President, we saw that in the vicinity of the Monstrat village, they saw the installation of some 2-inch HDPE pipe, some 1,200 feet in length, Madam President. Work was also done on the Charlestown Bypass Road, where we would have installed new connections, Madam President, in complement of the road improvement work there at the Bypass Road. We saw, Madam President, that work is now being done, or work was done, Madam President, in the Rollins Drainage Project. And some 500 feet, Madam President, of pipe was installed on that project. Madam President, we also saw in the low ground area. This is an area that is in the vicinity of, on the other side of Cherry Garden, some 1,500 feet of 4-inch PVC mains that is now being installed, Madam President. Madam President, we also saw some 400 feet of 2-inch mains that were installed in the Prospect Estate area, directly opposite Mem's Pizza Place. We saw, Madam President, that some 300 feet of 2-inch mains that is expected to be installed at Westbury to alleviate extremely low water pressure. And Madam President, this is a project that I know we said 2-inch, but for some reason I believe we may actually change it, because we feel, Madam President, that the area may warrant a larger size pipe for future expansion. Madam President, we are hoping that some of the activities that we will engage in 2024, we want to see the extension of our SCADA network, that is our remote monitoring of tanks and pumps throughout the island of Nevis. And we are hoping that we'll be able to include Hamilton Well, the Hamilton Tank, the newly constructed Pond Hill Tank, and booster station. Madam President, we want to see the completion of the Zetlands Tank project, where we have a booster pump to be constructed there at the Zetlands pump station. Madam President, we want to see the construction of a well pump and generator station at Madden's and Butler's. And these are some pumping station houses, Madam President, that is in a state where, because of the high concentration of sea blast, Madam President, the steel in the roof of these buildings have become severely corroded. And we are hoping that in the new year, we will have a project to reconstruct those pumping stations, Madam President. Madam President, we are hoping that we will see the upgrade of pipe networks in Rollins Pasture with a 4-inch PVC pipe. We are expecting, Madam President, to complete the first phase of the Horatio Heights project there at the Horatio Heights, Madam President. We are also looking, Madam President.
Remember, that's your time.
Madam President, may I be allowed another 15 minutes, please? I think I can wrap with 15. 15? I have up to half an hour. I can take the half an hour, but I can do it in 15. Madam President.
So what's the request?
Half an hour, Madam President.
The question is that the member be permitted another 30 minutes to wrap up his presentation. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
Thank you very much, Madam President and members of the House. Madam President, the Nevis Water Department have recently brought on staff an engineer who we expect will be able to oversee some of the projects that we hope to undertake in 2024 and beyond. And that, Madam President, engineer would be attached to the Water Department itself. We are also in the process of procuring the services of a second engineer, Madam President, that will be attached to the Integrated Water Resource Management Unit. And Madam President, this is because we are taking water very seriously. And it is with that in mind, Madam President, that we will engage the services of these engineers on staff that will be able to ensure that we be in a position, Madam President, to do all that we need to do in our water department and our water resource management unit. Madam President, at the end of 2022, the Nevis Water Department saw a revenue total of $567,374.72. From January to December 4th, 2023, we have accumulated a revenue of $5,526,469.65. The difference of $40,905.07. And Madam President, the staff at the Water Department tell me that they intend to make up this $40,000. So they are expecting, Madam President, to surpass the revenue for 2022 over 2023, Madam President. Madam President, the mover of the budget spoke about, before I get to that, Madam President, I just want to highlight a few activities of the Integrated Water Resource Management Unit, which is a different component or different unit as it regards to water on the island of Nevis. The Integrated Water Resource Management Unit would have seen and oversaw the installation of the glass fuse tank there in Zetlands. Madam President, they are heavily engaged in the new drilling project, in analyzing of the bids. And Madam President, they are also engaged in phase 2 of the back supply for all schools, health centers and security buildings and disaster shelters. In 2024, Madam President, we are hoping, and the Integrated Water Resource Management Unit will oversee the new well drilling project, which we hope will be able to produce some 2.5 million gallons of water on the island of Nevis. We are hoping that in 2024 we will see the replacement of the water tank in the Morning Star area with a 400,000 gallon tank. Madam President, we are also hoping to make some preparation for the geothermal project with the construction of a 500,000 gallon storage tank. That, we believe, would later serve Hamilton and Jessup's Village. Madam President, we hope that in 2024 we will be able to expand our data collection initiative that would seek to improve the water management resource here on the island of Nevis. Now, Madam President, the member for Nevis number 2 and Minister of Finance and Premier would have indicated in this honorable house that there would be the reassessment of the water rates here on the island of Nevis. And Madam President, the current domestic rate is $13 per 1,000 gallons for the first 3,000 gallons. Above that, the rate increases to $15.60 per 1,000 gallons. That is what it now stands, Madam President. Madam President, the technical team would have proposed that the proposed domestic rates remain at $13 per 1,000 gallons for the first 2,000 gallons. They have proposed, Madam President, that $18 per 1,000 gallons between 2,001 gallons and 4,000 gallons. And above 4,000 gallons, the rate increases to $20 per 1,000 gallons. Put differently, Madam President, the first 2,000 gallons will be charged at $13. The next 2,000 gallons, between 2,001 gallons and 4,000 gallons, will be charged at $18 per 1,000 gallons. And above 4,000 gallons, the rate will increase to $20 per 1,000 gallons. This structure, Madam President, is proposed that people would not waste water. That is the idea here. Madam President, current commercial rates for hotel industrial rates stands at $32.50 per 1,000 gallons. So, Madam President, it doesn't matter how much 1,000 gallons you use. You can use up to 1,000,000 gallons. You are still being charged at $32.50. The proposed change, Madam President, in the commercial, hotel, and industrial rates, that $32.50 per 1,000 gallons up to 10,000 gallons. The rate increases to $45 per 1,000 gallons above 10,000 gallons, Madam President. So, Madam President, you can use 9,999 gallons. You will be charged at $32.50. As it now stands, you can use up to 1,000,000 gallons, Madam President, and you're still being charged $32.50.
Very cheap.
So, those numbers, Madam President, has been reworked. And let me repeat them for the commercial and hotel industrial rate. $32.50 per 1,000 gallons up to 10,000 gallons. The rate increases to $45 per 1,000 gallons above 10,000 gallons, Madam President. Madam President, for the agricultural sector and farmers, the concessionary rate of $6.50 per 1,000 gallons up to 10,000 gallons. Above that, the rate increases to $13 per 1,000 gallons. Madam President, that is what it is now. Let me go over that again. For the agriculture and the farming sector, it now stands at $6.50 per 1,000 gallons up to 1,000 gallons. Above that, the rate increases to $13 per 1,000 gallons. That is what it is now, Madam President. Up to 10,000 gallons, Madam President. It is suggested that the rates for farmers be changed to $8.50 and $15 respectively. Madam President, for seniors living alone, there is no change for consumption up to 3,000 gallons. It is suggested, Madam President, that that rate remains the same when it comes to our seniors. Madam President, with regards to truckers or water delivery services, the current rate now stands at $52 per 1,000 gallons. And the new rates, Madam President, is proposed to be $75 per 1,000 gallons. Madam President, we have been discovering some anomalies lately where persons have been disconnected and we have seen some illegal reconnections. Let me say that again, Madam President. We have seen, Madam President, that persons have been disconnected and they have found themselves back on the supply. We have seen, Madam President, that some meters were locked. And, Madam President, those meters miraculously operating again. Somebody decided to dismantle the locking mechanism on some of those meters. Madam President, I did a check with the good folks at Nevis. And I've been told that if anyone tampers with Nevis meters, it's a $5,000
Yes.
$5,000 fine. We are a little more generous, Madam President. Madam President, we are saying that if there is any illegal connection, there will be a fine of $1,500. And if there is any tampering, Madam President, with the water meter, that is going to be a $2,000 fine. Madam President, no. I am asking, Madam President, that persons do not interfere and tamper with the water supply if they are disconnected. For a number of reasons, Madam President, but one reason in particular, Madam President. We do not want to have a situation of contaminant in our water system. I am asking, Madam President, of the general public, please do not tamper with the connection if you are being disconnected, and do not tamper with the meter. It opens up the system to an entire different set of circumstances, Madam President. And I'm making that appeal, Madam President. Madam President, we are hoping that these new rates, as it regards to the adjustment in our water prices, will come into effect on the 1st of March 2024. Madam President, I want to end by thanking my entire team at the ministry, the permanent secretary, the assistant secretary, the office staff, the various directors, Madam President, and the general staff throughout the ministry. While 2023 was a challenging year, I believe that we still got quite a bit accomplished, Madam President. And I'll be honest, while we also did not get all that we wanted in the budget, we are still thankful, Madam President, and we will work with what we have. I want to say, Madam President, that we will ensure that we continue to reposition the Ministry of Communication and Works to support a resilient and sustainable Nevis, Madam President. And Madam President, I want to thank my colleagues on this side. I want to thank you for the additional time. And I want to thank, Madam President, all those who would have listened and all those who would have gave advice throughout the year. I believe that 2024 will be a very exciting year here on the island of Nevis. Thank you very much, Madam President, and I wish this bill safe passage through this honorable House.
Recognize the member for Nevis 3.
Madam President, I rise to move a motion for the adjournment of the House until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Madam President, I rise to second the motion.
The question is,